Anyway, you have exactly 5 seconds to explain why you think you belong in this room. Captain Ethan Walker said loud enough for every pilot and flight attendant gathering outside the briefing room to hear, his voice carrying the unmistakable confidence of a man certain he was protecting company protocol. The hallway fell unusually quiet as dozens of eyes shifted toward the tall black man standing calmly a few feet from the entrance. Marcus Ellington did not step backward. He did not argue. He simply adjusted the sleeve of his charcoal gray suit and looked at the captain with steady composure. The morning sun poured through the terminal windows, reflecting softly across polished floors while crew members carrying flight bags slowed their pace, sensing that something unexpected was unfolding before one of the airline's most important departures of the day. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we are glad you are here. Now back to Marcus Ellington. Captain Walker folded his arms across his chest. This is the pilot briefing, he continued. Authorized flight crew only. Passengers and visitors are not permitted beyond this point. Marcus nodded politely, showing neither frustration nor embarrassment. I understand the policy, he replied in an even voice. May I ask whether anyone verified my authorization before deciding I should not enter? Walker barely hesitated. I do not need to verify anything. I know every pilot assigned to today's flight, and I have never seen you before. A few crew members exchanged uncertain glances. One first officer quietly looked toward Marcus, noticing how remarkably composed he remained despite the attention gathering around them. A young flight attendant named Olivia Bennett also watched carefully. She had worked enough early morning departures to recognize nervous passengers, confused contractors, and airport visitors who accidentally wandered into restricted areas. Marcus did not resemble any of them. His posture reflected quiet confidence rather than uncertainty. He carried no signs of panic, no rushed explanations, and no attempt to force his way inside. Instead, he waited with unusual patience, almost as though he expected the truth to reveal itself without raising his voice. Walker interpreted that calm differently. To him, it looked like someone refusing to accept clear instructions. Sir, he said more firmly, I am asking you one final time to step away from this doorway. Marcus glanced briefly toward the conference room where pilots were preparing for the safety briefing before returning his attention to Walker. Captain. Captain Ethan Walker remained planted in front of the briefing room door, convinced that every second he delayed this unfamiliar man from entering proved he was doing exactly what a responsible captain should do. Around him, flight crew members shifted uneasily, sensing that the conversation had become about far more than access to a restricted room. Marcus Ellington stood with remarkable patience, his hands relaxed at his sides, never once raising his voice or attempting to move past the captain. His calm presence contrasted sharply with the growing tension filling the hallway. Walker looked Marcus up and down before speaking again. This area is reserved for pilots, dispatch personnel, and authorized executives directly assigned to today's operation, he said. If you have business here, someone would have informed me. Marcus answered without hesitation. That is a reasonable assumption, Captain. However, assumptions should never replace verification. Walker gave a polite but dismissive smile. I have been flying for more than 20 years. I know who belongs in my briefing room. Marcus nodded respectfully. Experience is valuable. That is why I expected experience to begin with one simple question instead of one immediate conclusion. Several crew members exchanged silent glances. Olivia Bennett quietly studied Marcus again. His tailored suit was elegant without being flashy. He carried a slim leather portfolio instead of luggage. His airport identification badge remained clipped neatly inside his jacket pocket, almost as though he had made no effort to display it unless someone asked. Everything about him suggested preparation rather than confusion. Still, no one stepped forward. Walker continued speaking with complete confidence. Sir, every minute we spend here delays an important briefing. If you are waiting for someone, I recommend stepping into the public terminal. Marcus answered with the same steady tone. I am waiting for someone to verify facts before making a decision. The simplicity of the response created another uncomfortable silence. One first officer quietly opened the airline employee directory on his tablet, seemingly considering whether to search for Marcus's name. Before he could type anything, Walker noticed the movement. "That will not be necessary," the captain said firmly. "We already know everything we need to know." The first officer slowly lowered the tablet again, although uncertainty remained visible on his face. Olivia felt increasingly uneasy. During her years with the airline, every recurrent training session emphasized professionalism, respect, and verification. She could not remember a single lesson encouraging employees to rely on appearances. She finally gathered enough courage to speak. "Captain," she said carefully, "would it help if we contacted operations just to confirm?" Walker looked at her briefly before answering. "There is nothing to confirm. We cannot question protocol every time someone arrives at a restricted doorway wearing a nice suit." Marcus showed no sign of offense. Instead, he looked directly at Olivia and offered a small grateful smile for simply asking the question no one else had asked. Then he returned his attention to Walker. "Captain, I appreciate your commitment to security," he said sincerely. "Security becomes stronger when it is supported by accurate information." Walker checked his watch impatiently. "This discussion is over." Marcus glanced once toward the briefing room before calmly replying, "Only if everyone here is comfortable making decisions without first confirming whether those decisions are based on the truth." His words settled across the silent hallway with quiet force, leaving several members of the flight crew wondering whether the most important lesson of the morning had already begun long before the briefing itself. The quiet tension outside the briefing room continued to grow as more members of the morning flight crew arrived, each slowing their pace after noticing Captain Ethan Walker standing firmly between Marcus Ellington and the entrance. What had begun as a simple disagreement now felt like an unspoken test of judgment unfolding in front of everyone. Marcus remained exactly where he had been from the beginning, composed and patient, making no attempt to step past the captain or challenge his authority. The confidence in his posture was impossible to ignore. It was not the confidence of someone trying to win an argument. It was the confidence of someone who already understood how the situation would eventually resolve itself. Captain Walker glanced toward the growing crowd before speaking again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "please proceed inside as scheduled. We have an important briefing to begin." One by one, the pilots and flight attendants entered the conference room, though many quietly looked back at Marcus as they passed. Olivia Bennett hesitated near the doorway. She looked at Marcus, then at Captain Walker, clearly uncomfortable leaving the situation unresolved. "Captain," she said respectfully, "operations can verify visitor authorization in less than 60 seconds. It might help everyone move forward." Walker shook his head. "There is no operational reason to delay this briefing for someone who has not identified himself." Marcus answered before Olivia could respond. "Captain, I have identified myself several times. The only thing I have not done is insist that anyone believe me without verification." Those words caused another first officer to pause halfway through the doorway. He quietly turned back toward Marcus. "Sir," he asked politely, "do you have an airport credential or executive identification?" Marcus gently reached inside his suit jacket, but before he could remove anything, Walker raised his hand. "That will not be necessary," he interrupted. "If we begin checking credentials for every individual who appears at this door, we abandon established procedures." Marcus slowly withdrew his hand without the slightest sign of irritation. "Interesting," he replied calmly. "Most procedures begin with checking credentials." A few members of the crew lowered their eyes, recognizing the simple truth in the statement. The hallway became noticeably quieter. Even employees walking past sensed that something significant was unfolding. Walker checked his watch once again. "This conversation has delayed us long enough." He reached for the radio attached to his uniform and spoke in a measured professional voice. "Airport security. This is Captain Walker outside briefing room 3. I need an officer to assist with an unauthorized individual refusing to leave a restricted crew area." Several heads turned immediately toward Marcus, expecting some visible reaction. Instead, he nodded slightly, almost as though the decision confirmed something he had hoped would not become necessary. "Thank you, Captain," Marcus said with complete sincerity. Security officers are trained to verify identities. Perhaps they will ask the question that should have been asked at the very beginning. Olivia looked at Marcus with growing respect. She realized he had never once argued against security, policy, or authority. His concern had always been about fairness and verification. The difference suddenly became impossible for her to ignore. As the distant sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the terminal corridor, everyone outside the briefing room found themselves waiting for the next decision, unaware that the arrival they expected would soon change far more than access to a single meeting. The approaching footsteps grew louder until two airport security officers turned the corner and walked calmly toward the briefing room. Their expressions remained professional, showing no sign that they expected anything unusual. Captain Ethan Walker stepped forward before either officer could speak. "Thank you for coming," he said. "This individual has refused repeated instructions to leave a restricted crew area." One of the officers nodded politely before turning toward Marcus Ellington. "Good morning, sir," he said. "Would you mind telling us what brings you here today?" Marcus returned the greeting with the same calm respect he had shown everyone else that morning. "Certainly," he replied. "I arrived for the executive observation scheduled before today's operational briefing. I have simply requested that someone verify my authorization before deciding I do not belong here." The senior officer appreciated the direct answer. "May I see your identification, please?" Marcus reached inside his suit jacket and carefully removed a leather credential holder. Before he could fully open it, Captain Walker spoke again. "Officer, there is no need to waste time with this. We have an entire flight crew waiting." The officer looked at Walker respectfully but answered without hesitation. "Captain, verification is part of our procedure. It will only take a moment." Marcus handed over the credential without saying another word. The officer examined it carefully. His expression did not change, but he immediately reached for the communication radio attached to his shoulder. He quietly confirmed several details with airport operations while the hallway remained completely silent. Crew members who had already entered the briefing room slowly gathered near the doorway again, curiosity overcoming the pressure of the schedule. Olivia Bennett watched every movement closely. She noticed that Marcus never looked anxious. Instead, he simply waited, allowing the process to unfold exactly as he had requested from the beginning. After a brief exchange over the radio, the officer returned the credential to Marcus with visible professionalism. "Thank you for your patience, sir," he said. "Operations has confirmed your authorization. They also informed us that senior leadership is already on the way to this location." A ripple of confusion moved through the hallway. Captain Walker frowned. "Senior leadership?" he repeated. "For what purpose?" The officer answered honestly. "They did not provide additional details. They only instructed us to ensure Mr. Ellington remains here until they arrive." Walker looked directly at Marcus, searching for some explanation that still fit the assumptions he had made only minutes earlier. "Who exactly are you meeting?" he finally asked. Marcus gently placed his credential back inside his jacket. "The same people I expected to meet before entering the briefing room," he replied. "Nothing about my schedule has changed." The answer offered no boast, no challenge, and no attempt to embarrass anyone. It simply reflected complete confidence that events were moving exactly as they should. The hallway became quieter than ever before. Even those who had supported Walker's decisions now found themselves wondering why airport operations had responded so quickly, and why executives were suddenly changing their own schedules. Olivia exchanged a brief glance with one of the first officers, who slowly lowered his eyes after realizing that a single verification at the beginning could have prevented the entire confrontation. Far down the terminal corridor, the sound of several hurried footsteps echoed once more. This time it was not airport security approaching. It was a group of senior executives moving with unmistakable urgency toward the briefing room, and every person standing outside instinctively turned to see who they were coming to meet. Every conversation in the hallway came to an immediate stop as 5 senior executives appeared at the far end of the terminal, walking with unmistakable purpose toward the briefing room. Their pace was brisk, yet their expressions carried concern rather than confusion. Employees instinctively stepped aside to clear a path, recognizing members of the airline's executive leadership team. Captain Ethan Walker straightened his uniform, assuming they had arrived because of the security disruption. He prepared himself to explain that he had acted according to company procedures. Marcus Ellington remained exactly where he had been from the beginning, calm and unhurried, watching the approaching group without the slightest change in expression. Olivia Bennet noticed something unusual almost immediately. None of the executives looked toward Captain Walker first. Their attention remained fixed entirely on Marcus. The executive vice president of flight operations reached him within seconds and extended his hand with genuine respect. "Good morning, Mr. Ellington," he said warmly. "I sincerely apologize that you were left waiting. We were delayed in another operations meeting and expected to meet you before the crew briefing began." Marcus accepted the handshake with a polite smile. "Good morning. I appreciate you coming." The vice president glanced around the silent hallway, quickly sensing that something had happened before his arrival. "Has everything been all right?" he asked. Marcus answered with complete restraint. "There was a misunderstanding regarding authorization. I requested verification. The security team handled that professionally." His response surprised everyone listening. He did not accuse anyone. He did not exaggerate what had happened. He simply described the facts without emotion. Captain Walker looked from Marcus to the executives, struggling to understand why every senior leader seemed to know the man he had confidently identified as an unauthorized visitor. One of the directors quietly asked the vice president, "Should we begin the executive introduction inside the briefing room?" The vice president nodded before turning back to Marcus. "Everyone has been waiting for your operational review. The flight crew will appreciate hearing your perspective before today's departure." Several pilots exchanged confused looks. An operational review led by Marcus? Olivia noticed the first officer beside her slowly inhale, as though pieces of an unanswered question were finally beginning to fit together. Captain Walker stepped forward carefully. "Excuse me," he said. "May I ask exactly what Mr. Ellington's role is in today's briefing?" The hallway became perfectly still. The vice president looked at Walker with mild surprise, clearly assuming everyone already knew. Before answering, he glanced briefly toward Marcus, who simply gave a small nod, signaling that the truth could now be shared. "Of course," the vice president replied. "Mr. Ellington personally requested to observe today's crew briefing as part of his ongoing review of operational culture throughout the company." Walker frowned slightly, still searching for clarity. "Operational culture?" he repeated. The vice president smiled politely. "Yes. Mr. Ellington believes leadership begins by understanding the everyday experiences of employees at every level of the airline." Marcus remained silent while every eye in the hallway slowly returned to him. The growing realization spread through the crew that the quiet man who had spent the entire morning asking only for verification had never been trying to gain access through influence. He had expected to be treated fairly before anyone knew who he was. Yet even with the executive standing beside him, Marcus made no effort to explain further. He simply looked toward the briefing room door and waited, allowing the final truth to arrive in its own time while the silence around him grew heavier with every passing second. The vice president slowly turned toward the assembled flight crew, his expression shifting from polite surprise to quiet concern as he realized that not everyone understood who had been standing outside the briefing room for the past several minutes. He took one measured breath before speaking clearly enough for every pilot, flight attendant, dispatcher, and security officer to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "allow me to make a proper introduction. This is Mr. Marcus Ellington." He paused briefly before continuing. "Mr. Ellington is the owner of this airline." The words settled over the hallway with astonishing silence. No one moved. No one spoke. Several crew members instinctively looked back toward Marcus, searching his face for any sign that the statement might somehow be exaggerated. Instead, Marcus simply stood with the same composed expression he had maintained since arriving that morning. Captain Ethan Walker felt the confidence that had guided every decision only moments earlier disappear completely. He replayed the conversation in his mind with startling clarity. Every instruction, every assumption, every opportunity to verify the facts before reaching a conclusion. Olivia Bennet quietly lowered her eyes, remembering that Marcus had never once demanded special treatment. He had asked for only one thing from the beginning: Verification. The vice president continued speaking. Mr. Ellington regularly visits our operations without advance announcements because he believes leadership should understand the real experience of both employees and guests. He has often said that the strongest company culture is revealed during ordinary moments, not scheduled presentations. Several members of the crew exchanged uneasy glances. They suddenly understood why Marcus had remained so patient throughout the entire encounter. He had never been testing anyone through confrontation. He had simply allowed normal decisions to unfold naturally. Captain Walker stepped forward slowly, his voice noticeably quieter than before. "Mr. Ellington," he said sincerely, "I owe you an apology." Marcus met his eyes with calm respect. "Captain, this morning was never about my title." Walker nodded, clearly struggling to find the right words. "I believed I was protecting company procedures." Marcus answered gently, "I believe you were trying to do your job. The question we should all consider is whether we followed every part of that job." Those words carried far greater weight than any criticism could have. Marcus looked briefly around the hallway before continuing. "Policies exist to protect people. Verification is one of those protections. When we replace verification with assumptions, even good intentions can produce unfair outcomes." The security officer who had verified Marcus's identification quietly nodded in agreement. "That is exactly why we check credentials before reaching conclusions," he said. Several pilots looked toward Captain Walker with expressions that reflected understanding rather than judgment. They knew how quickly routine decisions could become habits. Marcus then turned toward Olivia. "Thank you for suggesting verification when others preferred certainty." Olivia seemed surprised to be addressed directly. "I was only remembering our training," she replied softly. Marcus smiled. "Training only matters when someone is willing to apply it under pressure." The hallway remained silent once again, but the atmosphere had completely changed. The tension that had once centered on authority now centered on reflection. No one seemed concerned about schedules anymore. They were thinking about something much larger than a delayed briefing. They were thinking about how easily appearances had shaped decisions before a single fact had been confirmed. Marcus glanced toward the briefing room entrance and spoke in the same calm voice that had carried him through every moment of the morning. "If everyone is ready, perhaps we can begin the briefing we were all supposed to attend. I believe there are important lessons waiting inside, and some of them have already begun out here in this hallway." The briefing room remained unusually quiet as every member of the flight crew took a seat. Yet the conversation from the hallway continued to echo in their minds. Captain Ethan Walker sat at the front of the room with a humility that had not been there when the morning began. Marcus Ellington entered only after every pilot, flight attendant, dispatcher, and operations manager had already found a place. He did not choose the head of the conference table. Instead, he selected an ordinary chair along the side of the room, quietly reinforcing the very lesson he hoped everyone would remember. The executive vice president of flight operations stepped forward and addressed the group. "Today's operational briefing will continue as scheduled," he said. "However, before we discuss weather conditions, flight plans, and safety procedures, Mr. Ellington would like to share a few observations." Marcus slowly stood and looked around the room. Every face met his with complete attention. "Thank you for allowing me to be here this morning," he began. "I visit our operations because reports and spreadsheets can measure performance, but they cannot always measure culture. Culture reveals itself through ordinary decisions made during ordinary moments." No one interrupted. Marcus continued in the same calm voice that had never changed throughout the morning. "When I arrived outside this briefing room, I was not concerned about whether I would eventually gain access. I already knew the process would lead to the truth. What concerned me was something much more important. I wanted to know whether someone unknown would be treated with fairness before anyone recognized a title, a position, or a name." Captain Walker lowered his eyes. Marcus immediately noticed and addressed him with respect rather than criticism. "Captain Walker, I appreciate the responsibility you carry every time you command an aircraft. Safety depends on decisive leadership, but decisive leadership must always leave room for verification. Confidence should never replace curiosity." Walker nodded sincerely. "I understand that now." Marcus smiled gently. "Understanding is where improvement begins." He then looked toward the rest of the crew. Many people believe discrimination always begins with anger. Often it begins much more quietly. It begins when assumptions are allowed to replace questions. It begins when appearances are treated as evidence. It begins when someone decides they already know enough without verifying the facts. Olivia Bennet listened carefully, realizing that every sentence described what had unfolded only minutes earlier. Marcus continued. Today was never a test designed for any individual. I did not come here hoping someone would fail. I came hoping our culture would succeed. Every employee deserves a workplace where dignity comes before assumptions. Every passenger deserves respect before recognition. Every colleague deserves to be seen as a person before being judged by appearance. The room remained completely silent. The lesson carried more weight, because it had not been delivered through embarrassment or punishment. It had been delivered through patience. Marcus closed the folder he had carried since arriving that morning and looked around the room one final time. Leadership is not proven by the authority to stop someone at a door, he said. Leadership is proven by the wisdom to ask one more question before closing that door. Several crew members quietly nodded. Even those who had remained silent in the hallway understood that they had witnessed something far more significant than an uncomfortable misunderstanding. They had witnessed a lesson capable of changing the culture of an entire airline, and every person in the room knew that the conversation was only beginning.